presento il professor Rüstem Aslan, che è professore nel Dipartimento di Archeologia dell'Università di Çanakkale in Turchia, nella Troade, ed è tra l'altro lavora come membro della facoltà presso la stessa università e autore di numerosi studi accademici sia nazionali che internazionali. È anche membro della Fondazione Troi, dell'Istituto Archeologico Germanico, dell'UNESCO. Ha partecipato lui stesso, prima di diventare direttore degli scavi, a numerosi scavi archeologici a Troia e ancora oggi ne conduce diversi, quindi ha diversi progetti di ricerca in atto. Dunque, dal 1988, oltre al suo lavoro archeologico in diverse regioni anche dell'Anatolia, ha continuato sempre gli scavi nella città di Troia, in particolare dopo la morte del professor Kaufmann nel 2005, che era il precedente direttore degli scavi, ed è diventato co-presidente degli scavi di Troia. Dal 2013 continua sempre nella città di Troia e ha pubblicato diversi articoli sia in turco ma anche in inglese e in tedesco. E tra l'altro si dedica anche alla diffusione non solo di articoli scientifici, cioè il professor Aslan praticamente diffonde anche al grande pubblico quelli che sono i frutti e i risultati delle sue ricerche. E tra l'altro, questo ci tengo a dirlo, ha anche pubblicato un libro di poesie, Death and Shadow, sulla città. Vorrei solo citare alcuni suoi versi. Questa terra scura su cui passo, le strade della città che si estendono come i rami di un millennio, la luna che cresce con dolore, il modo in cui sono venuto dal dolore e del silenzio. Non c'è traccia sotto nessuna pietra, l'amore che unisce due mondi, il pilastro più sacro della cosa in cui sono nato, l'acqua che ammorbidisce l'intonaco, la terra che modella l'altare e il fuoco che distrugge l'acqua. Grida la mia identità, non c'è traccia sotto nessuna pietra. Quindi diciamo che Rüstem Aslan è talmente, in qualche modo la città di Troia fa parte della sua anima in qualche modo, e quindi esprime questo suo grande amore verso la città di Troia anche attraverso la poesia. Questa sera ci parlerà della città partendo dalla mitologia e dalla narrazione di Omero, e ci trasporta proprio tra le rovine di Troia. Svela per noi la storia delle numerose città che si sono succedute l'una dopo l'altra, l'una al di sopra dell'altra, dalla prima età del bronzo fino al periodo greco, al periodo romano e ottomano, e poi l'abbandono e l'oblio. Ci narra poi l'affascinante storia degli scavi partendo da Schliemann e dalle vicissitudini del tesoro di Priamo, che il governo ottomano tentò fino all'ultimo di recuperare e riportare in Turchia, fino ai recenti scavi condotti dagli archeologi tedeschi e poi, come diceva, dal professor Kaufmann e poi dal professor Aslan stesso. Infine prende in considerazione l'importante documentazione ittita proveniente da Attusa, che sembra offrire prove certe della storicità della guerra di Troia. Quindi I give you the floor and speak slowly. Grazie a voi. Adesso il professore.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank for the invitation, and really for me it's an honor to speak on Troy in such impressive atmosphere and such important places. I give a conference first time in 2018 within the scope of the Year of Troy. Later, within the scope of the Aeneas Cultural Route project, we meet each other 2 times with Italian colleagues in Troy, in Edremit, and then in Rome. I'm very happy to be in Rome again. Thank you very much. Troy is a very difficult and complex subject. On the one hand, Homer's epic and its impact on cultural history. On the other hand, archaeological discoveries that has been going on for 150 years. There are many questions about this important topic. Is there really a place called Troy? Did the Trojan War really happen? Are there the treasure of Priam in Troy? Are the heroes of the Troy real people or just imaginary from Homer's epic? And we can continue this question. Today, I will try to give answer to this question with my knowledge after 35 years of experience in Troy. And also, I will try to give relation the Turkish people with Troy and with Homer. And I wanted just to give an impression how was possible to succeed at the Troy Museum. It's open 2018. Let's begin with mythology. Paris, son of Priam, king of Troy in Anatolia, had abducted the fabulously beautiful Helen, wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. In revenge, a coalition of Greek kings set sail with 1,000 ships to raid the cities of Anatolia and besiege Troy. After 10 years' siege, was finally broken by a Greek ruse. Pretending to depart, they left behind a wooden horse, apparently a thank offerings to the gods. The Trojans took the horse into their city where, after nightfall, Greek emerged from the horse's belly, opened the gates to the attackers, and Troy was sacked and burned. It was a brutal victory, which, however, left the Greek participants disoriented and ruthless and led to the eventual collapse of the heroic age and its civilization. And here you can see the oldest pictures, depictions about Trojan horse, just around 100 years after Homer, in the first pictures, and second pictures also 100 years later. And here you can see the Trojan horse just in front of the Troy ruin. This is now there is several Trojan horse in Çanakkale, in the city of Troy. Historians date the Trojan War to sometimes between 1200 BC, 1130 BC. And Homer's epic story contains many elements that date from the second millennium BC. Homer is believed to have been born in Smyrna, today's Izmir, west part of the Turkey, and to have compiled the stories of the events during the Trojan War, around 730 BC in his epic poem, the Iliad. Homer does not tell the whole story of the Trojan War. For example, the story of the Trojan horse is not in Iliad, but it's mentioned in the Odyssey, which is thought to have been written by Homer around 20 years later. The Odyssey tells the story of events following the Trojan War and the adventure of the Achaean soldiers on their return journey to their homeland. A depiction of the Trojan horse on the Mykonos, just before we saw the pictures, was dating from the 670 BC, and other saints illustrating the war demonstrated the legend was current in the ancient world at that time. Other stories of the Trojan War were related over the centuries that followed. One of the best known of this is by Roman poet Vergilius, whose Aeneid, approximately 20 BC, established a supposed link between the Romans and the Trojan. The Trojan Aeneid was said to be founder of the Rome and ancestor of a ruling in Roman dynasty. And after the Homer's times, the Iliad was constantly copied and passed down over the generation. The oldest and the best preserved complete copy of the epic poem is a 10th century copy in Istanbul. The first printed copy of the epic was published in Florence in 1488, and from that time onwards became the most important work on European culture and literature. Whether the events related in the epic were true or not, and whether the city of Troy existed or not, were questions that preoccupied scholars centuries. And you can see now here the first map of the Le Chevalier, 1791. It was one of the groups of the scholars sent at that time the French ambassador Jules Goffour from Istanbul. He sent to west part of the Anatolia to research to find the real city of Troy. And if you look carefully, you can see there's the two rivers, Scamander, Simois, and there's some names it's mentioned in Homeric epic. And Le Chevalier actually, he claimed that he found the real Troy, but we know the location of the Le Chevalier's Troy was not correct. And here you can see after Le Chevalier was a lot of travelers to visit Troy and around Troy, and you can see the backside. There's a wonderful pictures from William Gell in 1804. Backside you can see the Tenedos, island Tenedos. The name was kept until today. The people use the Tenedos. We know from the Iliad, and then was wrong location from Le Chevalier is kept around 100 years. Now you can see the Scamander River as the top of the hill, so-called the Pınarbaşı. They believe it's the Troy. There was four tumuli, graves, dedicated to Hector or some another, and the people at that time was sure was a real Troy here because and Scamander, and there is some burials from the so-called Trojan heroes, but you can see the first picture of Troy from Jules Goffour, published 1802. If you look carefully, backside there's a tumuli, and you can see the Turkish villages, so-called Çıplak. But if you look to Troy, it's actually on the surface nothing visible. It was actually that's the main problem why the researcher couldn't find the real Troy, because was nothing to see on the surface. And in other pictures, and Le Chevalier tried to prove with maps is the location of Troy, and in some part of the Iliad he put in his maps. For example, you can see the entrance to Dardanelles. It was the harbor of Achaean Greek ships, and it's actually this wrong location goes more than 100 years. And the first time, Charles McLaren, is actually a geologist. He published maps without visiting the sites, and he published an article in 1822 without visiting the site. Just his argument was the Iliad. In the Iliad, if you read the Iliad, Homer tells the location of Troy. The two rivers comes together, Scamander and Simois, and flee to Dardanelles. The Troy must be there, and he published his books 1863, and after the publication, we know Frank Calvert is a member of the Calvert family. He purchased small part of the Hisarlik, and he began to excavate it first time in Hisarlik 1863 and 65, but he had not enough money to make large-scale excavation. And 1868, the first time the Schliemann, Henry Schliemann, he visited Troat, and as I showed the Le Chevalier card before, he just made the 1 week excavation on Ballada. He was disappointed, and before he went to Istanbul, he passed his ships and meet in Çanakkale, in Dardanelles, with Frank Calvert. And Frank Calvert tells the theory of the Hisarlik, and then Schliemann decided to excavate it from at the beginning to 1870 without a permission, and then his big scale excavation he began 1871 until 73. Then there's some gaps, and until his death he excavated in Troy 1890. After Schliemann, Wilhelm Dörfeld, his architect, actually he began work with Schliemann 1882, and after his death he worked on Troy, and we can say one of the first correct publication came from Wilhelm Dörfeld. And after Wilhelm Dörfeld, we know the Cincinnati team, Carl Blegan, from 1932 until 1938. And also I was from the first years on, after Carl Blegan, 50 years gap, Manfred Korfmann from Tübingen University, Germany. He began to work 88, and I was student at that time, and was, let's say, very big archaeological groups, and he used different kind of magnetic prospects and so on. After Kaufmann's death, Ernst Perniska, also from Tübingen University, and Brian Rose from Cincinnati, they work in Troy till 2012. And let's look to Schliemann. Schliemann is a very complex person, so really sometimes he manipulated his publication. And first 3 years, especially first 3 years, he destroyed Troy, and he smuggled most of the find because he came actually not from the university, just a self-made man. What he could write and publish in different languages, but his aim was to prove the historicity of Iliad and prove the Hisarlik is Troy. You can see the site is maybe if you look carefully you can see the Schliemann trenches, which I showed you at the beginnings, was an artificial hill. Schliemann, he just leveled it and cut, let's say, the 80% Hisarlik from 1870 until 1890, and his picture shows very good. But he tried to connect it with archaeological find, for example, which we have in Iliad, Depas Amphicephalon or Megaron buildings, which is mentioned in Iliad. He said he found in Hisarlik in Troy, and with this archaeological finds, and he said he proved the historicity of the Trojan War, and also is the Iliad is not just imagination from the Homer. But it's very still under discussion, so-called Priam's treasure. He found, we know today, end of May 1873, and he called Priam treasure, and he smuggled all of the treasure, and it was it is the first pictures, iconic pictures from Sofia Schliemann in Athens after the publication, and you can see the find place is William Dörfeld. And it was a discussion if the Schliemann really found all the treasure in Troy, or he purchased somewhere else, or he collected from old finds. But we can say today, Schliemann, he found 22 treasure, and all of the treasure came from Hisarlik, from Troy. It's nearly 100% nearly, we are sure. But after after the publishing the article in a German newspaper as a Priam treasure, and was the Ottoman people, they recognized the importance of the treasure. But I studied since 5 years with my colleagues on Ottoman document, and you can read here, it's actually Ottoman people to give him the permit because of the they believe that it will good for the science, and if all the find, if the city walls are discovered, their preservation as a whole and their public display are required. It was the permission which Ottoman government gave to Schliemann. And during the court case, and the Ottoman bureaucracy tried to get the fine, because his permit required also 50% the fine back to Ottoman back to Istanbul Archaeological Museum. And during the court cases in Athens, also Ottoman archives, we saw, we have the document. They try to protest that the Schliemann should sell the find. And there's one caricature in Istanbul is published during the court case. Actually, the Schliemann and Sofia Schliemann talk with each other, and it's really, it was at that time the Ottoman people, they have a huge interest on Schliemann, on treasure. And also you can see the first complete translation from Naim Frasheri in Iliad in 1886. But it was very interesting, because after the court case in 1882, Schliemann, he gave all his finds permanently for German state, and was published until the Second World War in Berlin, and was dissipated without any terraces. We know it was 1993, then Russian people, they give information, they kept all the treasure in Pushkin Museum, most of them, some small part in Hermitage. And still after 1995, 96, is now exhibited in Pushkin Museum, most of part, and another small part in Hermitage. Yes. Oops. The next slide, it doesn't work. Okay, after the Schliemann, I mentioned the Dörfeld. Actually, Dörfeld, he tried to prove the historicity of Trojan War with the architecture evidence. And for him, the Troy 6, which you can see with the red color, was the city of the Homeric Troy and the Trojan War. And we have to say, the Dörfeld, he used the first time the history of the archaeology coordination system. And most of the walls, which if you visit a site today, which is visible, came actually from Dörfeld excavation. Also, you can see the Troy 6 East Gate, and also he published in relatively after the excavation in 2 volumes his excavation results. And after the Dörfeld, the Blegan he excavated, and for him the Troy 6 was not the city of the Trojan War, especially Troy 7, and he gave another date, but Blegan was a very good archaeologist. He began to make the first time the typology of the ceramic, and he claimed that he found a burnt layer in a so-called South Gate, and he proved it was a burnt layer with a skeleton, with the weapons, arrowheads, and so on. And for him was Trojan War an historical event, is proved with archaeological records. And I have to mention, before beginning of the Blegan excavation, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk is the president of Turkish Republic. He gave the permission and he supported Troy excavation, and you can see the permit from the signet from the Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was the interest in the Turkish sides on Troy from beginning of the 30s was very strong. And after the Kaufman excavation, and you can see the Kaufman excavated not only Stadel, also outside of the Stadel Lower Town. He made the first time the very intensive magnetic prospection, and he recognized, you can see the red color is the artificial ditch, and also very big lower town from Hellenistic and Roman times, some Roman villa, some streets, and so on. But during the Kaufman excavation, there was President Turgut Özal. He published in French, in English, Turkey in Europe, and was 40 pages was about Troy and Gallipoli campaign, and was interest in Troy, also very strong in a political level in Turkey. But also you can see the president of Republic of Demirel in 1998. It was he supported the national park, Troy National Park, around the Troy, declared is in 1998 as a Troy National Park, one of the much best preserved landscape. Now you can see the Kaufman excavation result was exhibited in 2001. Troy Dream and Reality in Germany was still in Europe one of the most visited archaeological exhibition, and you can see the reconstruction is the Troy with the Stadel Lower Town with the landscape is one of the most important late Bronze Age city in west part of Anatolia, and also some in Lower Town is a very interesting finds, artificial ditch with the chariot and then some weapons during the late Bronze Age, and some figurines is connected to Anatolian culture, Hittite cultures, and there is 9 cities. It's very complex. At the beginning, I try to give information. The Troy is really not easy to understand. There's a complex one city, another city is more than 9 cities and a lot of another architectural layers, but also the landscape is changing, paleogeographic changing. At the beginning, Troy was very close to sea, and we know during the Late Bronze Age, during the Trojan War, it was in the middle of the sea was in the middle of the Trojan plain, and Beshik Bay, it was the harbor of Troy. And after the, let's say, the Trojan War or transition from Iron Age, was because of the Scamander River, the plain was filled with the alluvial, but Troy was not important anymore because of the paleogeographic situation, but it was important because of the story of Troy. Now you can see the different layers. Troy 1 is the early Bronze Age, is not special actually. It's Troy 2 and 3 is the all the treasure which I showed before. It came from Troy 2 and Troy 3. And 4 and 5, we have a very less information, but the Homeric Troy, Troy 6 and 7, and after the Troy 6 and 7, we have a so-called the Dark Ages around 300 years, and after the Hellenistic time, the Proto-Germanic time, Hellenistic Roman time, Troy was a very rich people. You can see the Troy 6 is related with the Trojan War, and here's the Roman time, the Athena temple, and the west part of the West Sanctuary in Hellenistic time, and special is you can see that today is we try to excavate it further in this area, and also plan of the Troy Hellenistic and Roman time is especially in Roman time. Troy after the visiting the Augustus and Hadrian, as Troy is get very rich city in Roman time, and a big theater and temple and sanctuary and so on. And we found was also during the Schliemann excavation was two Augustus head, but we found during the Kaufmann excavation Hadrian statue and Augustus head now exhibited in Troy Museum, and also it came from a lot of such a kind coins. It was Hector's throwing to firebrand of the Greek ships, and also Aeneas carrying the palladium is we found in Troy during the Kaufmann excavation. Is also very important to show the story of the Aeneas was so strong in Troy, and also it's me right part was 30 years ago, and Lower Town was very nice Roman villas, and was unfortunately was destroyed after the Roman time, but you can see the in Troy Museum some find, and also portrait of Julius Caesar, Octavianus, Augustus, and a lot of such a kind coins, and also the last destruction of Troy was an earthquake around 500, 600 AD, 2 times. It was very in short time, it was happened 2 times. And after the big earthquake, the Troy was never settled again. Now you can see again the Stadel and Lower Town. And is, of course, is to understand Troy is not easy because we have to look the Hittite document. There is a Hittite document with the name of the Vilusa, and Tarusa was a long time that the Hittitologists they discuss about it. The Vilusa as a Troya is now most of the Hittitologists they convinced as the name of the Troia, Tarausa, Ilios, Vilusa is also in Iliad. The Troy has a two name. And Alexander Treaty is a show to us between the king of Vilusa, Alexander, and Muwattali, king of Hittite. They made a treaty, and also we found Luwian seal in Troy to show to us Trojan people could understand and could corresponded within Hittite languages. And it's not easy to understand Troy. You need Homeric philology and results of the Homeric philology and historical records like Hittite documents and archaeological finds. And you have to put all of the three different areas results together. And is of course the reception of the Troy is as a sacred city was huge, and nearly all of the important people came to visit Troy. And after the big earthquake, 6 AD, is actually Troy was not settled again. But we know, if you read Herodot's historians, the king of Xerxes of Persia visited Troy 480 BC. Alexander the Great in 334 BC. And nearly all of the Roman emperors like Hadrian, Augustus visited Troy, and they made the votive offerings to heroes who had fought here. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, Mehmed the Conqueror, also visited Troy as related place chronicled Kurtovilos of Imros in his book about Sultan's campaign. And like in other historians. And if you read the Kurtovilos books, Sultan Mehmed visited Troy in 1462 as follows. He himself crossed the Hellespont with his army, passed through the Phrygia Minor, and arrived at Ilion. He saw from the ruins and terraces of ancient city of Troy that the city had advantage derivative from the site and environments, and its convinced links by land and sea. As well, he listening to stories of, about tombs on heroes of Achilles, Ajax, and the rest. He congratulated them for having a poet like the Homer in praise. They record their great achievements. People say that he nodded his head and declared, God has granted me to right to take revenge for the city and its people despite the passage of so many years. At the root of Sultan Mehmed's visit to Troy lay the idea that the Turks, returning to their roots in their ancient homelands after a long absence, inspired the conflict between East and West marked in the period. It demonstrated its importance he attached to earlier cultures in Anatolian and capacity as an Ottoman rulers. After there was strong interest from the Turkish side, and I can just explain, I worked since 30 years in Troy. It was our dream of Troy Museum. And at the beginning for 20 years, it was the first time Turkish Minister of Culture planned things to plan about the Troy plan, and was 2011 was architecture competition in Ankara. and it was the first winners of the Turkish architect from Istanbul, and the Turkish Cultural Minister opened the Troy Museum. You can see the museum on the back side is Troy, very close, and after my lecture I will show to you a very short film about the landscape and about the Troy Museum. It was opened from the President Erdogan personally, and we also visit the treasure which the Penn Museum gave back 2011 with the condition it should permanently exhibited in Troy Museum. Now is exhibited since 2018 in Troy Museum. Conclusion, I think it's not so long, it's okay. In the Bronze Age, on the shore of Dardanelles, there was a city, it was called Troy. In the heyday, it was the most beautiful city in the Aegean world. The city is reflected in the poems of Homer, who composed the story of Troy 500 years on. The city of Troy fell around 1300 BC, an earthquake, but it was rebuilt immediately afterwards. About 4 generations later, 1180 BC, Troy is burned and destroyed, this time an external attacks. Attackers were most likely Mycenaean. The tale of the Agamemnon's expedition to Troy goes back to Bronze Age, as we know from the Linear Bay tablet. A Trojan War did happen, which I think, when I started to work 88 in Troy. The wooden horse, as a classical writers thought the story so absurd, they rationalized it as a siege engine, siege machine. Helen of Troy, history's golden girl, the face that launched 1,000 ships, did she really exist? In archaeological records, love leaves no traces. Thank you very much. But
thank you so much. 3 minutes. Oh.
There's a very short films about landscape and about museum. Can we show us?
C'è un video.
Without the musics. Now you go to Troy. It's actually the lower town. Is the backside is Troy, and you will see now Trojan horse in front of the Troy. In very backside the Trojan plain and Dardanelles, and is if you look the small Odeon Roman time, and right side you can see the Schliemann Trench, and as you can see the backside the Europe Gallipoli Peninsula, and Troy was the lower town. It's a very backside you can see the Troy Museum and is a protecting group for the Troy 2, for Troy 2 and Troy 3. The landscapes, the Homeric landscape, I call the Homeric landscape because there is a so similarity with the Homeric description about landscapes and recent landscapes. And is Troy Museum and the Turkish village was founded 1893. Is actually the museum is immediately periphery on a site. I said it was a architecture competition outside the curtain. It should give an impression like the mud break, and there's a 3,000 square meter exhibition area, and it was 2,000 pieces exhibited now from the region. And you go with the Homer, and then you go up 9, 8, 7, 6 until end Troy 1 with some finds. And as you go to inside of the site and cities, which I was very happy. The first 2 weeks was the villagers. They from field they came to visit the museum and the places which they lived some generation about the history. They visited most of them first time the museum, And first part is the Trat, and another excavation will exhibit it, especially from prehistoric time to Roman time. There is a lot of children project, contemporary art exhibition and contemporary art exhibition salon, and some is mapping and some another modern exhibition technique use. And as I say, was built in 4 years. It takes 4 years, and there's no steps. You go like you walk from the one city to another city, and top of Troy. In the highest point of the museum is the same level with the Troy original. That means it's not higher than site. And now you can see the so-called famous Polyxena sarcophagus is one of the most important find in museum. It came from the Troy, is close to Troy. It showed to us the story of the Trojan War was so embedded deeply in a landscape, and there is also a Trojan horse inside of the museum, and as there is some history of the archaeology, and you can look outside the Homeric landscape if you walk up, and as I invite all of you to Troy Museum. Thank you again very much.
Thank you so much. Devo dire che è veramente molto interessante. Il museo è bellissimo, quindi vi invito ad andare a vedere il nuovo museo che è inaugurato nel 2019, che è un po' anche nella struttura, in qualche modo ripropone proprio questa le varie fasi di Troia, dall'ingresso fino ad arrivare all'ultimo piano, che un po' racconta anche la storia della ricerca. Ci sono domande che possiamo fare se vuoi anche Daniele, vuoi
No, only two questions.
Two questions.
The first is, what do you think about the character of Schliemann? And the second is, if the new excavation will be able to in compensating the damage of the Schliemann's excavation, and from the point of view of the reconstruction, archaeological reconstruction and historical reconstruction of Troy.
Thank you. It's very not easy to answer this question. Schliemann is a very complicated person. He destroyed Troy. He smuggled the find. Is nobody never we can give up. Really, but I have to say, with his publication in different languages, the books and articles, he converted his arc to Troy. And after the Schliemann publication, all the Homerologists, they begin to discuss about Homeric epics, the reality of the historicity of the Trojan War. He is just not only one person anymore. He is also typical Philhellenist in 19th centuries. He has an idea about Philhellenist idea and against the Turks and Ottomans and so on. Really, it was the last year, 200 years, the Schliemann's University. And I give a lot of lectures. Now I try to understand Schliemann from the Ottoman document, because he manipulated also sometimes his publication, but I have to say he's a person, his times is very complicated, not normal persons. But without the Schliemann, there is no Troy.
Okay.
And the damages of the Schliemans, and of course, is the also if you read the Schliemans carefully, and if, after 3 years excavation, he said, "Oh, I damaged." He understood his own mistakes, that he destroyed for the most important part of Troy for forever.
And one question. How many visitors have you after COVID, after a period?
Yes, the COVID was a terrible time. I was just before the COVID in Rome, and I know it's really, I talked with some colleagues from Italy. It was a terrible 2 years for us. And before the COVID was around nearly 800,000. And this year again is around 600,000. Last year 600,000, but this year it looked like most of the people, I think, they want to travel to visit, and we expected 1 million, more than 1 million. So. And site and museum.
Ok, thank you. Ci sono altre domande? Ecco. C'è una domanda.
Merhaba, Rüstem hocam. How are you doing? I had a quick question from a couple summers ago when we were having a conversation about if there's a potential location for...
Sorry.
Oh.
Stand up.
If there was a potential location for the Battle of Troy, because we were discussing if it was nearby the region or if it's more complicated than that.
It's not easy to prove the Trojan War, but we have, I saw a paleogeographic map. Now, Professor Kayans, he works still on paleogeography. He's nearly sure that the harbor of Troy, Beshik Bay, is opposite the Tenedos, as not the entrance to Dardanelles. And if you look from that point of, it must be between the harbor and Troy. That's mean, but we have a more than 20-meter alluvial field, top of the Trojan plain, and we can try to show the places, but there's of course archaeological to prove is now nearly impossible. But there is a lot of philological analysis is between the harbor and the Troy. Is look like if the Homer already visited the site and know the landscape so well and so detailed information, it cannot be artificial. It's sure. But after the 30 years, I can say I believe that the Homer was a real person, as a poet, and I believe what was Trojan War, not what he described in the Iliad, but such a kind war between Achaean, Mycenaean, and Troy, and I believe most of the heroes, Achilles, Hector's, they burned there, they fight there, they died there. Why not?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Ci sono altre domande?
Sorry, I would like to know if the earthquake of February of March, I think, is far from the ruins of Troy.
It's very far away, but we know in historical time, prehistorical time, there is a lot of earthquake in Troy. And Troy 6 is also Dorfeld and Blegen recognized the earthquake, and the Blegen idea was like this. There is an earthquake around 1300 BC, and we have archaeological evidence, and 4 generations after, there's a burnt layer, and it was the 60s was the interpretation. Okay, during the siege, it's happened earthquake, and because of the earthquake, the city get weak, and was it possible for the Mycenaeans to besiege the Troy, and therefore, the earthquake god is Poseidon. His attribute is horse. Is maybe Homer put the stories together, and metaphoric the Trojan horse. It was the idea is in the 60s, but most of the Homer philologists they rejected this theory.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ci sono altre domande?
Hi, good evening. My question is like a personal question. I would like to know how did it impacted you, not just as an archaeologist, but as a human being, spending all these years in such a legendary site, you know, in the company of the ghosts of all these amazing fallen heroes. Because we heard some of the beautiful verses of your poetry, and I would like to know a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's I worked since last centuries, from 88. But I have to say, in middle schools, I begin to read Iliad, and really still I'm fascinating the power of the Iliad, imagination, and the power of the poetry. And I think all of the excavator, if you look the archaeological research history, they affected because of the Homeric epic. And my personal motivation is the Homer's Iliad and poetry and his power. And when I read again and again, I look the site, and you can feel the aura of the places and connect it with the power of the poetry. It's just for me, it's the motivation is from Homer. And then come, of course, the Schliemann and another excavation and so on. Is you after a long time you feel yourselves the piece of the cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you. Altre domande?
But sorry, is one question.
Altre domande? No. Forse mi sono sbagliata. I'm sorry.
But okay.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting, especially in such a beautiful building, if you can hear me. My question is that what direction do you want to take the Troy dig in the future? Would you be interested in excavating more prehistoric or Homeric or Hellenic? And what can we hope to see from Troy in the future? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And also, you have experience, you work in Troy. Is after 150 years, is after so many publications, so much excavation, it was not easy to decide it for me to excavate it in Troy. Nearly everything is here, but but still there's some questions. I think, especially, there is one big question. Schliemann, Dorfeld, Kaufmann, everybody tried to give answer, couldn't. Where is the cemetery, necropole? There's a two possibility. The Trojan people unmortal, and second second possibility is, which I mentioned, is the alluvial field, Troy and around the landscapes, and we have some evidence from the paleogeographic research also last summer, and it's indicated cemetery under 8 meter with burnt layer, human bones, and we will try to excavate it there. It's of course can be big sensation. And another is inside of the citadel. We have new trenches which Schliemann left. It's a very small part of, but I don't want to excavate it completely, because if we excavate it, then there is no Troy anymore. And to keep it for the next generation, I'm sure the next generation, as you, as archaeologists, will have a technical more knowledge and possibility, and they should have a possibility to prove the old excavation results. And in Lower Town also we plan something. Troy is, but all the time you have a surprise. And last summer, especially outside of the Troy, nobody can expect it. Is very burnt. Troy 6 burnt layer, and was the last 2 days. And this summer we will try to extend the trenches and excavate it immediately outside of the citadel. This burnt layer is Trojan bone. Don't know.
Thank you. Altre domande, visto che sono tutti interessati? Una.
What do you think about the wooden horse? Was it a horse or was it a ship?
There is a lot of theory, except the horse is horse. There is a lot of theory, except the horse is horse. There was an Italian philologist. He said the horse is not horse, is warrior ships, because the Iliad is with Homer said the horses, the warships, the horses of sea. But when I talk to really serious philologists, Homer philologists, it's not possible. Is a look like is a siege machine. It's like if you look the Bronze Age, early Bronze Age Anatolian, Alajoics or another excavation, and in City Gate there is a depicted horse, and also Near Eastern tradition, the horse look like horse as a machine. You can attack them back. But the problem is how and why and when Homer convert the stories. But maybe it's also possible they give really is as a gift horse. But two incredible things in the story is in Troy and Homer's stories is one, how they both sides can make the war 10 years because of woman, Helen, as you cannot believe, and Trojan horse. But can be some, the reality is a change, convert, and mixed with Homer, with another reality. But my personal opinion about his prehistoric archaeologist is a siege machine, and its origin came from Near East.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Nessun altro.
And maybe I have to say some last words. The Aeneas project, which we work together. Now there's Aeneas route in the Troad, and there's a strong interest of it. And I saw the exhibition. It's a very nice exhibition compilation.
Thank you.
And I hope the collaboration will be also in the future with Troy in Rome.
Yes.
So, thank you again.
Thank you. Our project will be continued. Thank you al pubblico, grazie per essere stato qui così anche numeroso questa sera. Quindi è un progetto che sicuramente continueremo. Tra l'altro la nostra mostra dovrebbe essere anche è un progetto tra il Ministero della Cultura e il Ministero degli Affari Esteri. C'è questo progetto di trasferire la mostra in altri luoghi sempre lungo la rotta di Enea, quindi toccando la Tunisia, l'Albania, la Grecia, per arrivare poi a Troia. Quindi thank you so much. Grazie.